Sometimes history hides not because it's lost, but because no one knew it was there. In the early 1920s, British India was a place of empire, excavation, and ego. Archaeologists were racing to uncover ancient secrets across the subcontinent, but most of them were focused on the big names, the Mauryas, the Mughals, or the ruins of Buddhist monasteries. But in 1921, a quiet dig near a town called Harappa, now in modern Pakistan, would flip that script entirely. It started out small, a few scattered bricks, then a wall, then streets, but these weren't random or broken ruins like most sites. These were organized, structured, almost modern. "These bricks are too uniform," one researcher said. "Someone designed this." Then came Mohenjo-Daro, 640 kilometers to the south. Another dig, another city. This one, even more astonishing. Side note, Mohenjo-Daro literally means mound of the dead. No one knew why, not yet. As they brushed away the layers of time, the archaeologists realized something eerie. This was a civilization, a lost one. Entire cities, planned cities, beneath their feet, gridded streets. Homes connected to a central drainage system, massive public baths, giant reservoirs, hundreds of wells, warehouses, markets. And then the big shock, no signs of kings, no monuments, no palaces, no statues of gods or generals, just a system, a society, quiet, functional, clean. Who were these people? Why haven't we heard of them before? What they had stumbled upon was not just a city, it was the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the three great cradles of civilization, alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. Only this one was completely forgotten. Let that sink in. While the Egyptians were building pyramids to house pharaohs, the people of Mohenjo-Daro were building homes with private toilets. While Babylon was scribbling laws into stone, the Indus cities were running underground sewer systems. But there was something strange about all this, something that didn't fit the pattern. Most ancient civilizations love to brag. They leave behind epic poems, war murals, and statues taller than trees. But not the Indus people. They left no grand narrative, no "I am King so-and-so" inscriptions, no record of battles or empire, just the city. A whisper, not a roar. And that's where the mystery deepened. Who ran these cities? Who built them? Why were they abandoned? And why? Did no one remember them? The discovery of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro should have shaken the historical world. And to some scholars it did. But at the time, colonial powers had little interest in rewriting textbooks for a civilization that didn't fit their preferred narratives of conquest, power, and war. A peaceful, advanced society with no empire, no warlords, no epic kings to worship. It didn't sell well, but for the archaeologists who stood in the dust of Harappa, one thing was clear. They hadn't just found ruins. They had uncovered an entire world, a world older than Babylon, more organized than Egypt, and as we'd come to learn, far more mysterious. The more we found, one archaeologist wrote, the less we understood. The cities of the future, where we dive deep into just how futuristic and shockingly advanced these cities really were. Discovery of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. It began, as many great stories do, with an accident. In the year 1921, a group of British and Indian archaeologists were digging in the Punjab region of what was then British India. They weren't looking for a lost civilization. They thought they were excavating an old Buddhist site, maybe something from the Mauryan Empire. But what they found was something else entirely. At first, it was just some bricks. Fired clay, neat and rectangular. Then walls, then streets. Then a city, a planned city. Unlike anything they'd seen before in South Asia, this site would become known as Harappa. A year later, another excavation, this time farther south near the Indus River. The same bricks, the same layouts, the same eerie, organized calm. This was Mohenjo-Daro, and it was about to become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. You see, ancient ruins usually tell a story of power. Palaces, temples, fortresses, statues of rulers, inscriptions praising gods or detailing wars. But here there was none of that. No great ziggurats, no sphinxes, no tombs packed with gold. Instead, grid systems, sewage channels, water tanks, warehouses. This wasn't a city built for spectacle, it was a city built for people. As they dug deeper, the scale became clear. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't a lone outpost. It was part of a vast network, dozens, maybe hundreds of cities, all following the same architectural logic. Straight streets intersecting at perfect angles, homes made from the same size bricks, wells in almost every yard, a central marketplace, a great bath that might have been used for rituals or perhaps for something as simple as public hygiene. It was, to be blunt, shockingly modern. And Harappa? The same story. Nearly identical layout, the same planning, the same silence. What was this civilization that had emerged and disappeared without anyone noticing? The researchers dubbed it the Indus Valley Civilization, named after the river that had once nourished its cities. As the years passed and more sites were uncovered, Lothal, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, the map of the Indus world grew, and with each new find, the mystery deepened. Because despite their sophistication, the Harappans left behind almost no decipherable writing. Their script, carved into seals and tokens, remains undeciphered to this day. Just a few symbols, no bilingual texts, no long records, no scrolls or stone tablets, just silent, beautiful cities and 1,000 questions. Who ruled them? How were they organized? How did they communicate across such vast distances? What held this vast society together? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did it all fall apart? In some of the most well-preserved sites, like Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists found the remains of bodies lying in the street. Not many, but enough to spark questions. Were these victims of an attack? Disease? A sudden collapse? The truth is, we don't know. What we do know is this. By around 1900 BCE, the great cities of the Indus Valley began to decline. People left, the streets went quiet, the baths emptied, the bricks stopped being made. And for over 3,000 years, no one spoke their name. It took colonial-era railroads, which ironically used Harappan bricks as ballast, to accidentally expose their ruins to the world again. Imagine that. A civilization so advanced that its bricks outlasted its memory. A culture so quiet that history forgot to remember it. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro weren't just archaeological finds. They were a whisper from the deep past, rising through the dust to remind us, not all great civilizations build empires, not all brilliance wears a crown, and not all stories are told by the victors. Sometimes the most remarkable cultures are the ones who simply lived well and left quietly. Urban planning and infrastructure. Imagine walking into an ancient city, one built 4,000 years ago, and seeing something eerily familiar. Not dirt paths winding through chaos, but wide, straight streets, intersections at perfect right angles, neighborhoods designed with precision. That's what the Indus Valley Civilization built. This wasn't just ancient, it was urban planning at its finest. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa are textbook examples of how to build cities for people. Each city followed a consistent layout, a central elevated area known as the citadel, and a lower residential area sprawling below. But even the lower areas were methodically designed. Let's start with the bricks. The people of the Indus Valley didn't just build with mud and hope. They fired their bricks in kilns and made them to exact proportions, 1 to 2 to 4, height, width, and length. That kind of standardization suggests centralized control or at least an advanced sense of engineering. Now imagine this. Every house, rich or poor, had access to clean water. Wells were dug deep into the earth and lined with those same standardized bricks. Some neighborhoods had public wells, but many homes had their own private ones. And what about sanitation? This is where the Indus cities shine. Each house had some form of bathroom or latrine, with waste flowing into covered drains that ran along the main streets. These drains were regularly cleaned through inspection holes, like manholes in modern cities. Yes, the Indus Valley had working sewer systems, while much of Europe still used chamber pots a few thousand years later. Then there were the public buildings. One of the most famous is the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a large watertight pool surrounded by small rooms. Some say it was used for religious purification. Others think it might have been a public bathhouse. Either way, it required sophisticated watertight masonry and drainage, a feat of engineering. Granaries, too, played a key role. These were enormous storage facilities built on raised platforms with air ducts below to keep grain dry. Think of them as ancient food banks, ensuring supply in times of shortage or drought. Then there's the layout itself. Streets ran north-south and east-west. They were often divided into blocks. Some had covered sidewalks. The uniformity across multiple cities suggests a shared culture, or at least shared city planners. And yet, what's even more impressive is how little inequality appears in the remains. There are no giant palaces, no homes vastly superior to others. Most residences were modest, a few rooms, maybe a courtyard. It suggests a culture where function came before wealth, and society valued collective order over individual power. There's also evidence that cities like Lothal in modern-day Gujarat were important trading ports. Lothal had a dockyard, perhaps the world's first, connected to an ancient river that once flowed to the Arabian Sea. This wasn't just a city for survival. It was a hub for movement, commerce, and trade. Lothal's streets slope in such a way that monsoon waters would run off rather than flood the city. That shows knowledge of hydraulics and seasonal weather patterns. These weren't guesses, they were calculations. The Harappans were, by every measure, practical architects. They didn't build sky-high monuments to gods or kings. They built infrastructure, things that worked, things that lasted. Even their building orientation is fascinating. Most structures aligned with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. Some scholars believe this had astronomical significance, possibly tied to the movement of stars or solstices. What's clear is that these weren't just farmers or traders. They were engineers, urban designers, city planners, hydrologists, sanitation experts. And all of this existed over 4 millennia ago. One traveler from the future, let's say a Roman or a Chinese official from the Han Dynasty, could have walked into Mohenjo-Daro and been stunned not by its strangeness, but by how much it resembled a functioning, well-planned city. And perhaps the most remarkable thing, there's no evidence any of these cities were ever rebuilt, not like Babylon or Athens or Rome. They were designed once, and designed well. No do-overs, no revisions. How did a civilization from the Bronze Age get this so right? That's the question that still haunts historians and archaeologists. Because this level of planning doesn't happen by accident. It comes from vision, collaboration, and shared values. Values we might still be chasing today: culture, daily life, and trade. When we think of ancient civilizations, we often imagine towering monuments, extravagant rituals, or bloody warfare. But the Indus Valley people left behind a different story, one woven into the fabric of their daily lives. So what did a normal day look like in a city like Mohenjo-Daro? Start with the home. Most houses had 1 or 2 stories, made with those now iconic standardized bricks. They were often built around a central courtyard, a space for cooking, relaxing, or family gatherings. Some even had indoor bathrooms connected to drainage systems, a luxury even many Romans didn't have centuries later. There's also evidence of multi-room layouts suggesting designated spaces for sleeping, eating, and storage. Larger homes may have belonged to merchants or city officials, but even these weren't extravagantly large. Modesty, it seems, was a common theme. In the markets, merchants traded goods like beads, bangles, terracotta figurines, pottery, and tools. The craftsmanship was impressive. Beads made from carnelian, lapis lazuli, and agate were drilled with such precision that it baffles modern researchers. These weren't just trinkets. They were trade goods, art, and possibly even status symbols. The famous Indus seals, small square carvings with animals and mysterious script, might have been used for stamping goods, like branding or signatures. Many seals feature unicorn-like creatures, bulls, or elephants, suggesting both cultural symbolism and deep connection with animals. Interestingly, no large temples have ever been found. That doesn't mean the Indus people had no religion, but if they did, it was likely decentralized and practiced privately. Some believe the Great Bath in Mohenjo-Daro hints at ritual cleansing, like early forms of Hindu purification. Others point to the mother goddess figurines and the reverence for fertility symbols. But the absence of religious monuments tells us something important. Power was not centralized in a religious elite. The spiritual world may have been personal, domestic, or local, quite unlike the towering priesthoods of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Children in the Indus cities probably played with terracotta animal toys and carts. Miniature models have been found in various sites, tiny bulls, monkeys, and wheeled carts with functioning axles. It's a touching reminder. Even 4,000 years ago, kids were still kids. And while they played, their parents likely worked in skilled trades. The Indus Valley economy was diverse. Farmers, potters, weavers, metalworkers, traders. They grew barley, wheat, peas, sesame, and possibly rice. Evidence of cotton cultivation makes the Indus Valley the earliest known producer of cotton fabric. This cotton was spun into thread and woven into cloth. Imagine that. Long before denim, the people of Harappa were walking around in breathable, hand-woven cotton clothes. Trade was more than local. Archaeological finds show that the Indus Valley had contact with distant lands. Shells from the Arabian Sea, lapis from Afghanistan, and seals found in Mesopotamia suggest a vast trade network. They may have traded by land and by sea. Lothal's dockyard and warehouse indicate organized maritime activity. The presence of cubical weights and standardized measures further shows a well-regulated economy. These weren't just barter systems. This was commerce. And not just commerce, but bureaucracy, without kings or armies. It's here where the Indus Valley defies the usual script. Most civilizations we know from history relied on power hierarchies to enforce rules, collect taxes, or wage wars. But the Harappans? Their cities show no evidence of weapons or military barracks. No murals glorifying violence, no tombs of warriors. Instead, we see order and cooperation. A civilization doesn't survive and grow for centuries without some form of governance. But the Indus model appears to have relied more on community, shared standards, and perhaps local councils. Some have speculated about guild systems, associations of tradespeople managing their own affairs. Others suggest a merchant class ran things collectively, but without texts, we can only interpret the ruins. Still, the consistency across their cities, from brick size to street width, shows something powerful: unity without tyranny. And yet their silence is deafening. There's no record of great heroes, no autobiographies of merchants, no carved laws. Their script, still undeciphered, leaves us guessing. A people so sophisticated in trade, in art, in engineering, and yet not one surviving story. So we read their lives through what they left behind: beads, bricks, toys, seals. A woman fastening a shell bangle before heading to market. A child pulling a clay bull on wheels. a man washing in a courtyard as the sun rises over a quiet street. Their voices may be gone, but their lives, simple, peaceful, productive, still speak volumes. The Indus Script and Language Mystery. Of all the mysteries surrounding the Indus Valley civilization, one stands above the rest: their language. They wrote, we know that much. Thousands of small inscriptions have been found, carved onto soapstone seals, copper plates, pottery shards, and even tools. But what they wrote? That remains a secret. The Indus script, as it's now called, is one of the last great undeciphered writing systems in the world. Despite over a century of research, no one has been able to read a single sentence of it. The symbols are striking, pictographic, often beautifully etched. Some show animals, others resemble arrows, tridents, or combs. Most inscriptions are short, 4 or 5 characters, a few stretch to 20. But there's no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual texts, no helpful translation left behind. This silence has driven scholars mad. What language did they speak? Was it related to Sanskrit? Proto-Dravidian? Something entirely lost to time? Linguists and archaeologists have tried everything, from frequency analysis to computer modeling. They've compared the symbols to other scripts. They've looked for repeating patterns, guessing at what might be names, titles, or common words. But no breakthrough has stuck. Part of the problem is context. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Indus script isn't attached to large monuments or long texts. Most examples are tiny, seals likely used for trade or identification. Some may have functioned like modern logos or business stamps. Without long-form writing, it's hard to establish grammar or structure. There's also the possibility, controversial but real, that the symbols weren't a full language at all. Some scholars argue the Indus symbols may have functioned more like icons, branding tools, or religious markings, similar to the way we use emojis or road signs. But that theory raises new questions. If it wasn't a writing system, then how did a civilization this large organize trade, laws, and logistics? Surely they must have had a way to keep records, store knowledge, and communicate beyond speech. And if they did have a writing system, why didn't it survive in some translated form, passed on to later cultures? One theory is that the Harappan script was used only by a small segment of society, scribes, merchants, administrators, and that its loss was rapid when the civilization declined. Another theory? The script was connected to a spoken language that didn't survive, or wasn't adopted by the Indo-Aryans who arrived in the subcontinent centuries later. Here's what we do know. The people who carved those symbols were precise. The script was standardized, the characters repeated, and the placement followed rules. This wasn't random doodling. It was a system. And systems are built to convey meaning. The animals shown with the script, especially the so-called unicorn, a bull-like figure with one horn, may have had symbolic value. Perhaps clan emblems, perhaps spiritual guardians, perhaps something else entirely. The lack of deciphered texts leaves a gaping hole in our understanding. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know the names of their cities, their leaders, or their gods. We don't know how they measured time or marked their calendar. They're the only major ancient civilization without a known language. That's why the Indus script remains one of archaeology's holy grails. Imagine what might happen if we cracked it tomorrow. We might uncover the names of kings or queens. We might read stories, myths, prayers, poems. We might learn about their science, their medicine, their laws. It would be like hearing a ghost speak. But until then, the script remains a closed book. And yet, even in silence, it speaks volumes. It tells us these people were organized, literate, and symbolically minded. They had complex identities. They cared about communication, enough to stamp symbols on every object they sent out into the world. They may not have shouted their stories in stone like the pharaohs or emperors, but in their own way, they carved a whisper, one we're still trying to hear. Because maybe, just maybe, the most sophisticated language isn't the loudest one. It's the one that outlives empires, by asking us to listen closer. No kings, no wars, a peaceful people. If there's one thing that separates the Indus Valley from almost every other ancient civilization, it's this. They left behind no evidence of war. Think about that. No swords, no spears, no fortresses bristling with battlements, no paintings of battles, no heroic tales carved into stone, not even grand statues of warrior kings or pharaohs in chariots. By all appearances, the Indus Valley people didn't build their civilization on blood and conquest, but on trade, order, and cooperation. In city after city, archaeologists have found consistency, not chaos. Brick homes, drainage systems, wells, all built to similar standards across hundreds of miles. That suggests shared knowledge, shared priorities, and maybe even a shared government, but not a central emperor or warlord enforcing it all through violence. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, there are no grand palaces or tombs, no clear signs of centralized authority. If there were rulers, they didn't flaunt their power through size or monumentality. Some scholars believe the Harappan society may have been a collection of city-states, each operating independently but following a common cultural code. Others suggest a decentralized form of governance, perhaps ruled by merchant guilds or local councils. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. It worked. For over 700 years. The cities show no signs of being sacked or burned. There's almost no evidence of internal revolt or civil war. Even the skeletal remains found at places like Mohenjo-Daro, though sometimes shown lying in odd positions, don't bear marks of violent death. No crushed skulls. No arrowheads lodged in bones. If conflict existed, it didn't leave behind the kind of scars we see elsewhere in the ancient world. Now let's be clear, no society is perfectly peaceful. Humans are human. Disputes, power struggles, and crime likely existed. But the scale and style of Indus civilization suggest that violence was not institutionalized. It wasn't glorified or ritualized. Compare that with the Sumerians, who worshipped gods of war and chronicled battles as epic poems. Or the Egyptians, whose pharaohs marched into Nubia and Syria, carving their conquests into temple walls. Or the Assyrians, who proudly depicted the flaying of enemies. The Indus people? They didn't tell those stories, or they didn't think them worth carving into stone. And that silence speaks volumes. Perhaps their society was built more on consensus than coercion. Perhaps their economy, driven by trade and craft, encouraged collaboration over conquest. Their urban planning also hints at this. The cities weren't built for defense. Walls, where they exist, are modest. There are no moats or towers, no gates designed to funnel invaders. Instead, cities were open, accessible, and organized around public works, not fortifications. And then there's the absence of social hierarchy in the archaeological record. No royal tombs. No massive estates next to slums. While there are variations in house sizes, the differences are not extreme. It's a kind of urban equality rare in the ancient world. Even their art reflects this. The seals and figurines are beautiful, yes, but they don't depict kings towering over servants or gods smiting enemies. They show animals, trees, people at work or rest, scenes of life, not domination. It raises a fascinating possibility that the Indus Valley civilization might have been the closest thing the ancient world ever saw to a truly egalitarian society. Not perfect, not utopian, but balanced, quiet, functional. And that may be why we know so little about them. Because history, as it's often told, favors the loud, the conquerors, the kings who built pyramids to pierce the heavens, the generals who burned cities and reshaped empires. The Indus people didn't do that. They didn't leave behind slogans or statues. They just lived. And in doing so, They built something extraordinary without needing to dominate. Maybe they didn't fail to record their history. Maybe they chose not to glorify it. And in a world where power so often comes from violence, maybe that's the most radical idea of all. A civilization that proved, even for a little while, that peace could build just as much as war ever did. Theories about their sudden disappearance. For over 700 years, the Indus Valley civilization thrived. Then, it was gone. The great cities were abandoned. The streets fell silent, the wells ran dry, the seals stopped being carved, and the writing, whatever it meant, simply vanished. What happened? This is one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in ancient history. Unlike the fall of Rome or the collapse of the Maya, the Indus Valley's decline left behind almost no dramatic evidence, no epic invasions, no mass graves, no signs of natural disaster on a catastrophic scale. Instead, the collapse was quiet, gradual, almost invisible. And yet, by 1900 BCE, things had clearly changed. Let's start with what we do know. Around this time, archaeological evidence begins to show deterioration in the cities. The uniform brick sizes start to vary. Streets aren't cleaned as often. Drainage systems go unrepaired. The once carefully planned city grids begin to break down. People start to leave the big cities. They move to smaller villages, further east. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa fade into memory. Why? One of the most widely accepted theories is environmental. Many researchers point to changes in the course of rivers, especially the Ghaggar Hakra, which some believe was once the mighty Saraswati, a river mentioned in ancient Indian texts. If this river dried up or shifted dramatically due to tectonic movement, it could have spelled disaster. Without reliable water sources, agriculture would have collapsed, trade would have slowed. Cities dependent on irrigation and river transport would have become unsustainable. Add to that the possibility of climate change. Evidence from ice cores, lake sediments, and soil layers across South Asia suggests that around the time of the Indus decline, the region faced a period of major drought. The monsoons, critical to their farming cycles, became weaker and less predictable. A civilization built on reliable seasonal patterns suddenly found itself without its most vital resource, water. But environment alone might not tell the whole story. Another theory suggests the decline was due to internal social changes. As populations grew, the complex balance between trade, sanitation, and governance may have fractured. The cities may have simply become too large to manage without a centralized authority, or perhaps their decentralized system, once a strength, became a weakness in times of crisis. There's also a more controversial idea: invasion. The Aryan invasion theory, once popular among colonial historians, suggested that nomadic Indo-European tribes swept into the subcontinent and destroyed the Indus cities. But today, this theory is largely rejected or heavily revised. There's no clear archaeological evidence of mass violence or destruction. No scorched layers, no ruins flattened by war. Still, some argue there may have been cultural displacement, a gradual mixing or replacement of traditions as new peoples moved in. The Indo-Aryans brought horses, chariots, and a very different worldview, one that emphasized hierarchy, gods of war, and sacred texts. If this new culture slowly replaced the old, the disappearance might not have been violent, but it was no less real. Then there's disease. Some scholars suggest that densely populated cities like Mohenjo-Daro, with close living quarters and public baths, may have been vulnerable to epidemics. Without written records, it's impossible to confirm, but it's a possibility that mirrors patterns seen in later urban collapses. In the end, the fall of the Indus Valley was likely not caused by one single event, but a convergence of pressures. Environmental shifts, economic strain, social fragmentation, cultural changes, possibly even disease. And maybe that's the real lesson, that even the most advanced civilizations, with clean cities, strong trade, and peaceful coexistence, are not immune to collapse. That the systems we build are always more fragile than they seem. But perhaps the most haunting part of the Indus disappearance is this: no one remembered them. Unlike Rome or Egypt, whose legacies were passed down, retold, rewritten, the Indus cities faded from memory. For over 3,000 years, their story was buried beneath sand and soil. It took modern science, satellites, radiocarbon dating, archaeology, to uncover what had once been one of the world's most sophisticated urban cultures. And it makes you wonder, how many others have we lost? How many civilizations vanished, not in fire or war, but in silence? And how many might still lie undiscovered, waiting for someone to ask the right question, or dig in the right place? Why the world forgot them. How does a civilization vanish, not just from the earth, but from our collective memory? The Egyptians built pyramids so massive they've never been ignored. The Greeks gave us philosophers and myths. The Romans left behind roads, ruins, and an alphabet still in use today. But the Indus Valley? Gone. Quietly. Almost entirely. For over 3,000 years, no one remembered Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro. They weren't part of ancient histories. They weren't mentioned in sacred texts or passed down as legends. It's as if an entire chapter of humanity was ripped from the book and lost. How did it happen? Part of the answer lies in what they didn't do. They didn't build grand monuments to kings. They didn't carve their victories into stone. They didn't mythologize their past for future generations. They simply lived. And when their time came, they faded. Other civilizations made noise. The Indus people left only footprints. When the Vedic civilization rose in the centuries after the Indus decline, they brought with them an entirely different worldview: fire rituals, Sanskrit hymns, gods of war and order. Whatever remained of Harappan culture was likely absorbed, erased, or simply ignored. Without stories, there's no memory. And the Indus left few stories behind. Even when British colonists began excavating sites like Harappa in the 1800s, they didn't realize what they had found. Some of the ancient bricks were actually used to build railroads, the remains of a forgotten civilization crushed beneath steel and steam. It wasn't until the 1920s that archaeologists finally understood. This wasn't a provincial outpost or ruined temple. This was an entire urban culture, a civilization. And still the world was slow to respond, because the Indus didn't fit the narrative. They had no armies, no kings, no dramatic downfall, no golden masks or treasure-filled tombs. Their story wasn't written in blood or gold. It was written in sewage drains, well-planned streets, and undeciphered scripts. And in a world obsessed with spectacle, that kind of subtle genius gets overlooked. Textbooks favored the dramatic. Empires, wars, and revolutions made for easier headlines. Quiet efficiency? Not so much. Even in modern India and Pakistan, the Indus Valley is still under-recognized. Its legacy is scattered, politically, culturally, even geographically. Mohenjo-Daro lies in Pakistan, Harappa too. But the civilization stretched into modern-day India, Afghanistan, and perhaps beyond. This makes heritage ownership complex and sometimes contentious. Add to that the challenge of translation. With no readable script, it's hard to form a cultural bridge. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their prayers, their poems, or their proverbs. That absence creates distance. And yet, they're all around us, in brick dimensions still used in South Asia, in town layouts, in ancient weights and measuring systems, even in cultural motifs, fertility goddesses, water rituals, sacred animals, that echo across millennia into modern practice. In a way, the Indus Valley never truly disappeared. It just dissolved. Its people blended into what came next. Its cities crumbled but left behind DNA, both literal and cultural. And now, a century after rediscovery, we're beginning to listen. Scholars are reevaluating the Indus not as an anomaly, but as a blueprint, a civilization that prioritized stability over spectacle, function over fame. There's something humbling about a society that achieved so much, yet didn't scream its greatness into history. They didn't demand to be remembered, but maybe now, finally, we're ready to remember them anyway. What the Indus Valley teaches us today. So what does the Indus Valley civilization teach us? Why should we care about a culture that vanished 4,000 years ago, whose people left no grand monuments, no legends, and no decipherable writing? Because their silence might speak louder than anything else? In an age obsessed with conquest and spectacle, the Indus Valley shows us a different path. A civilization built not on kings and wars, but on cooperation, balance, and public good. First, there's the lesson of design. Their cities weren't just functional. They were thoughtful. Clean water, sanitation, public access to resources, grid-based layouts that prioritized efficiency and equality. Even today, modern urban planners look to Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa as examples of what cities could be. In an era of megacities choked by traffic and inequality, their quiet streets whisper, "There's another way." Then there's sustainability. The Indus people lived in harmony with their environment for centuries. They used local materials, managed water wisely, built homes and granaries suited to the climate. They didn't overbuild or overconsume. They didn't chase endless expansion. And when nature changed, the monsoons failed or rivers shifted, they adapted for as long as they could. Their eventual collapse may have been beyond their control. But the way they lived before that collapse, that still holds value. In our age of climate crisis, the Indus Valley reminds us that human flourishing is possible without constant conquest, without draining every drop, without dominating nature. There's also a lesson in humility. Here was a civilization more advanced than we ever imagined. And for 3,000 years, we didn't even know they existed. How many more stories have we lost? How many cultures shaped the world only to vanish without a trace? History is not a straight line. It's a web, full of dead ends, rediscovered threads, and voices waiting to be heard again. The Indus Valley challenges our definition of greatness. They didn't need towering statues or endless wars to make an impact. They built communities that worked, cities that lasted, systems that served everyone. Maybe that's what real greatness looks like. Not domination, but harmony. Not glory, but dignity. Not monuments to power, but infrastructure for people. And maybe that's why they were forgotten. Because they didn't shout, because they didn't destroy, because they didn't demand attention. But now, as we dig deeper, both literally and figuratively, we're starting to hear them again. Not in thunder, not in trumpet blasts, but in the quiet logic of their streets, the measured weight of their trade, the graceful symmetry of their wells and walls. They are reminding us that civilizations don't have to rise on blood and fall in fire. They can be built on cooperation, sustained by community, and remembered not for how loudly they ruled, but how wisely they lived. So if we're listening, truly listening, maybe the Indus Valley hasn't disappeared after all. Maybe it's still speaking. And maybe, just maybe, we still have time to understand what it's trying to say.